Hello, comrades. Welcome back to the Red Lettuce and our interview with Grover Furr. We are continuing the second part of this interview where we talk about imperialist lies against communist countries, specifically Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. The Imperial Core assigns the entire communist movement onto one man, which is a mischaracterization of the working class revolution that took place to secure power for workers. It is worthwhile to unlearn these lies so that we can see the victories of working class movements. Stalin surely made mistakes, but the crimes that he has been accused of are provably false. Regardless, the Imperial Core doesn't care if they're false, since Stalin serves as a cult of personality in the personification of communism, and more specifically, the supposed failures of communism. Grover Furr cites evidence through examining primary sources to disprove wild accusations that Stalin was an unpopular tyrant, both in the past but also in the present. Did Stalin do anything wrong? It's probably safe to say that he did a lot of things wrong. But the ruling class, however, has successfully run a massive smear campaign against worker solidarity by creating an evil boogeyman in Joseph Stalin. The USSR had a proletarian democracy and did not live under a tyrannical totalitarian dictatorship in the way the Germans lived under Hitler. The Imperial Core projects its insecurities outward onto this boogeyman figure to distract us from the ruling class dictatorship in our own backyard, while conveniently ignoring how closely it works with neo-Nazis, extremists, terrorists, and fascists throughout history and today. It's not useful to make extravagant claims like Stalin did nothing wrong, which itself is a meme on the left and a joke, but it is useful to examine history and evidence from the primary sources, which is Grover Furr's main interest and why he is often dismissed. He confronts the truth from a primary source which contradicts what we are taught. Many mainstream media outlets rely on the unknown or secret source to manufacture consent, and socialists are still trying to fight past imperialist lies, while juggling the near impossible task of questioning the talking points of the Imperial Core today. In this segment with Grover Furr, we confront some of the falsehoods of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the liberal contradictions of the West in making its own peace treaties with the Nazis. Grover also gives us his perspective and some history behind Poland's racist right-wing government and highlights Western passive collaboration with the Nazis who were fighting the communists on behalf of the Imperial Core. In this segment, Grover Furr tells us about how the Polish government abandoned the country, which invalidated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and left it vulnerable to invasion. We hope this inspires you to review this information yourself and search for history directly from the sources. We will see you in part 3, where Grover Furr tells us about the Katyn massacre and how the West continues to rehash Nazi propaganda about communism and the USSR.
Exactly. Moving on to our next question.
Sure.
People often think that Stalin was a tyrannical, psychopathic dictator. But what does the real evidence say about this narrative? What were his actual roles and duties?
Well, that's a huge question. I think that if you read, which few people are going to do, if you read the first 2 volumes of Kotkin's projected 3-volume biography of Stalin, both of which are, in the neighborhood of 1,000 pages long. But if you read them carefully, you'll see a kind of schizophrenic attitude towards Stalin. On the one hand, on the first volume, which only goes up to 1929, with a few exceptions here and there, Kotkin paints a portrait of a very intelligent, hardworking, extremely competent, dedicated communist. And that's pretty remarkable coming from, a card-carrying anti-communist like Kotkin or anybody. In the second volume, it's like he accuses Stalin of all kinds of stuff, which he obviously didn't do. I wrote a whole book critiquing that second volume called Stalin Waiting for the Truth, because it's astounding the number of falsehoods that Kotkin gets into. So there's a kind of disconnect between Kotkin's Volume 1 and Kotkin's Volume 2. I think the portrayal in Kotkin's Volume 1 is the correct one. Stalin was a dedicated, competent, intelligent Marxist and communist who tried to follow Lenin, and I think did follow him, although, Lenin died in 1924 and was really kind of out of the picture for almost 10 months before that. So you can't really say, well, what would Lenin have done in 1935 or something? That's absurd. But judging from his writings, I think Stalin tried to implement how he understood Lenin's plan for building socialism to be. One problem was, of course, that Lenin really didn't have much of a plan for building socialism, any more than Marx and Engels had. They didn't have much of a plan either. But I think that with a few passages, you might want to disregard that Kotkin was right. Stalin was a very competent person. Now there is an interesting thing in Kotkin's work. Kotkin, or anybody who writes about Stalin, even the anti-communists, right, have to come up with some explanation of how Stalin in the 1930s became, as you say, a tyrannical, psychopathic dictator, right? I mean, that's the sort of the mainstream narrative, right? Mass murder and so forth. So if he's not that up to 1929, what happened?
Right.
Right? I mean, did he bump his head? I mean, what happened? So, so Kotkin cooks up this story that he became paranoid because of Lenin's testament. Okay. Not that he believed it, but that he was hounded by it, and that this became a kind of, fixed idea in his head that he was being persecuted because of Lenin's testament, and became super suspicious. So that's his craziness. That's Kotkin's craziness, and it doesn't really figure. Kotkin was a student at Princeton University of a mainstream historian of the Soviet Union, now long dead, thankfully, named Robert Tucker, whose books are still in print. And Robert Tucker, back in the early 70s, 73, something like that, wrote a book about Stalin, which was a psychological history. He tried to breathe a life into the corpse of psychohistory. And he did that because of this problem. How do you explain how Stalin could have become this crazed mass murderer in the 1930s when there were really no signs of that beforehand? So the truth, of course, is that he wasn't any of those. He wasn't a crazed mass murderer. In fact, he wasn't a dictator. I have been collecting material for a number of years now that I'm going to use someday to write an article about how there's just no evidence that Stalin was a dictator by any of the definitions of dictator, and we have lots of evidence that he didn't act that way at all. Even one of the mainstream historians, a guy named Stephen Wheatcroft, who originally studied at Birmingham and the Soviet Studies program there, and has been in Australia now for 25 or 30 years. Even Stephen Wheatcroft, a very major figure in Soviet history, mainstream Soviet history, has an article that came out in 2004 called Team Stalin. He said, Stalin worked as part of a team. He was not a dictator. That article's never cited anywhere. Mm-hmm. Just like, he published it and it's like it vanished. But he has some evidence there, and I've got some other evidence. Stalin was not a dictator, and he was also not a brutal, harsh, vindictive, person, and there's lots of evidence of that too. So this whole notion that Stalin was a brutal dictator is completely false. I read a quotation sometime within the last month on the H-Diplo site. It's a mailing list, scholarly mailing list. Ronald Grigorsuni, who's 80 years old now, but who is a long-standing major historian of the Soviet Union in the United States. Taught for years at Michigan and other places. Was discussing something on this site and said, well, Stalin was a brutal dictator. And I mean, it's just, there's no evidence for any of that. But, that's what you got to say.
Yeah.
I was told years ago by two different people, actually, who, at different times, two mainstream Soviet historians who at least will speak to me, or at least correspond with me occasionally. Not that they approve of me, but they will correspond. That, Grover, you got to say something bad about Stalin. You're not going to have any credibility if you don't say in your books, if you don't say something bad about Stalin. And, the issue is, of course, by credibility, what they meant is within the field of Soviet history. I'm not concerned with having credibility within the field of Soviet history or being accepted by those people. I'm not in that field. If I were in that field, though, that would be good advice, right? You want to keep a job, you got to say bad stuff about Stalin. So there you go. I don't think any of you asked about the Katyn massacre, but you probably know what it is or what it's alleged to have been, right?
Yeah, we do have a question on that.
Oh, okay. Well, later on we'll get to that then. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go to your next question.
Yeah, I just think it's kind of funny because, how can you call him a dictator when he wanted to have contested elections?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's just ignored. I mean, in fact, Yuri Zhukov, who of course is retired now, I mean, he's 83 years old or something now, but when he wrote that book, Another Stalin, back in 2002, whatever it was, he was still a professor and had a high position in Russian academia, and he wrote this book called Another Stalin, and he points out that Stalin struggled hard to get contested elections, and man, he got slammed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and he's really sort of been persona non grata by all of the other, official legitimated Soviet scholars ever since he wrote that book, because that book just shatters the consensus that Stalin was a dictator. So they don't talk about that. They just don't talk about that.
I think it's also interesting that public opinion of Stalin in Russia is really popular. That I poll after poll that I see, or I've seen several news articles that say that there's a lot of Soviet nostalgia in modern Russia, and that they over 60% of the population miss the Soviet Union and hold Stalin in high regard. And that's not easy to. It's not easy to unpack that. It's not easy to accept that that's what.
Well, yeah. I think there is this issue of people's parents or grandparents at this point,
Mm-hmm.
having a very different narrative of the Stalin years than the official super anti-communist, super anti-Stalin narrative. There's that aspect. There's also this. I'm not saying that this is going to explain everything, every aspect of what you just mentioned, which is certainly true. There's also this, that in Russia, not anywhere else, but in Russia, there is a small space for pro-Stalin scholarship. I mean, Sakharov, for example, Valentin Sakharov, who wrote that book on the political testament of Lenin, was a professor at Moscow University. There was some discussion, journals about his book by other academics, and some of them were skeptical, others were more supportive. Nobody slammed him. Everybody thought it was at least an interesting study. Then there was Zhukov, whom I just mentioned here. And there are others, both in academia and outside of academia. There's a lot of historians in Russia who are sort of outside academia. So there's room there. It is possible to get what are generally called pro-Stalin books, right? I mean, they call my books pro-Stalin books, it's as though I'm trying to rehabilitate Stalin or something, which is not my goal. I'm just trying to tell the truth. But I mean, there's room for that in Russia. There isn't room for that, as far as I can tell, anywhere else. I mean, there's room for it in China, but leave China aside here. There's not room for that. You can't do it. You can't do that in Eastern Europe. You can't do that in the West. You can't write a pro-Stalin book, get it published by any kind of publisher, except a small left-wing publisher like the ones that I use in the United States or England or France or whatever. Okay, so Russia's different in that respect. The Russians did have their own revolution. It was their revolution, right? It wasn't brought by the Red Army like it was in Eastern Europe, so to speak. Then there are people who remember, or whose parents or whose grandparents remember the Stalin years positively. And then there is this space for contestation of the mainstream, Stalin was a horrible dictator narrative in Russia. So if you add all that up, and I guess if you add to it the widespread view that everything started to go to hell with Khrushchev. And then, and Khrushchev, of course, sort of inaugurated mainstream anti-Stalinism within the Soviet Union. And then, of course, Gorbachev, who went way beyond Khrushchev in his anti-communist sponsoring anti-communist lies and so on. And Gorbachev is rightly, more or less, regarded as the guy who's responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was very unpopular, as you point out yourself. Most of the people in the Soviet Union wanted to continue the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it wasn't, and that's even true in countries like the Baltics and Ukraine and so forth. So
when I learned that they had this referendum, and the support for continuing the Soviet Union was massive. There was so much. I think Uzbekistan had over 90% of the country wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, sure. No, it was not a people's revolution. Collapse of the Soviet Union was not done because the people were demanding it in any respect.
Right.
So so that, if you add up all those things, it's maybe not too. And of course, then there's World War II. Then there's industrialization, made the country big and strong. Collectivization, which is more controversial, but it did put an end to all these terrible famines, and the Soviet victory in World War II over the Germans. So if you add all of that up to what I was talking about before, there's a lot of reasons that people who are not into evidence, into studying history in any kind of formal fashion, there's a lot of reasons why people regard Stalin in a more or less positive light. And that, of course, is a problem for the anti-communists in Russia, and it's a problem for NATO. It's a problem for them, and they're worried about this. They're thinking, there's something wrong with these Russian people. What's wrong with them? Well, it's not that.
Right. On to dispelling some more myths.
Sure.
A big topic in a lot of left-wing forums or social groups that I've seen is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Sure.
Can you elaborate on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and dispel some myths around what it was and what purpose did it actually serve?
Yeah, well, I wrote extensively about this in my book, Blood Lies, and I have an article which is even more extensive on my website. Yeah, you got Blood Lies, good for you. Yep, that's it. Everybody run out, buy some copies.
Today.
Buy some copies for your grandmother.
Holidays are coming
out of it. Christmas. Sure. Anyway, and on my website, on my homepage, there's an even more extensive article, because there I could reproduce articles and documents and so forth and so on in a way which I can't really do in that book. It's widely lied about. There is, however, a a sort of contrary current, even within mainstream Soviet scholarship, that that is much more factual. There's a professor in Canada named Michael Carley. There's a professor now retired in Ireland, Jeffrey wrote Stalin's Wars. Well, I'll think of his name in a minute. Anyway, there is some disagreement with the mainstream narration of that is tolerated in the field of Soviet studies. Interestingly, the only way you make the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact look illegitimate or criminal in any way is simply by omitting the entire historical context, which is that, briefly, that the Soviets were trying to form an alliance against Nazi Germany, and the West didn't want it. The Western capitalists did not want it. France, England particularly, didn't want one. They wanted to encourage Hitler to move to the east, to attack the Soviet Union. Hitler seized the Rhinelands. He canceled the Versailles, Germany's signature to the Versailles Peace Treaty. He built up the army, which was not permitted. He built up the navy. The British finally signed a pact with him that would permit them to build up the navy. He wanted part of Czechoslovakia, the most industrialized part, that had some German, that of course it did have German, ethnic Germans living there, but it was the most industrialized part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. The French and British said that was okay. That was at the Munich sellout, September, October 1938. They refused to negotiate in any kind of real way with the Soviet Union. The Soviets, of course, did not want to get caught in a two-front war, because the Soviets in 1939, 38, and again in 39 had wars going on with Japan in the Far East. And the Soviets did not want to be in a position whereby they had to face Germany with no allies. You got to remember, the Soviet Union had no allies, no allies. They wanted allies, but they couldn't get any. When the British and French in August 1939 finally showed that they were not interested in any kind of real negotiation with the Soviets, of course, the Poles didn't either. The Polish government, right-wing, crypto-fascist government, super racist, super anti-Semitic, just disgusting, refused to deal with the Soviets. Then the Soviets signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression pact, which, by the way, all the other countries had non-aggression pacts with Germany too, long before the Soviets did. There was this secret codicil which divided Poland into spheres of influence. The most obvious interpretation of a sphere of influence is that this was to keep the German army away from the Soviet border. And that's, in fact, what happened. It was very, very important. Winston Churchill, I mean, not to praise him, but he was a smart man. Winston Churchill said in the House of Commons, it was very good that the Soviets signed this pact. I have the quotation in the New York Times article, in that online article that I mentioned, because it keeps the German army 300 kilometers away from the Soviet border, the previous Soviet border. Also, the part of Poland that the Soviets ended up with, Eastern Poland, had been taken from the Soviet Union in 1921 by the Treaty of Riga by Poland. And before that, it had been part of Russia. So as somebody has written, it's a perfectly obvious point. If you blame the Soviets for taking back Western Belarus and Western Ukraine in 1939 from Poland, then you had to blame France for taking back Alsace and Lorraine from Germany in 1918, which had been taken by Germany in 1971, right? 1871. So you know, that's the only way you can make the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact look like a bad thing is if you falsify the context completely. There was never an alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. It was not an alliance. There was not a coordinated invasion. None of that stuff. And I have all the details there. And as I say, there are a few Western historians who have published on this issue. They managed to get published, and they set this forth. That the major, so that's really a kind of dividing line between the, you know, sort of the liberal anti-communists and the right-wing anti-communists as you're at it in the mainstream discourse as your attitude towards the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It's important for today's super reactionary right-wing Polish government to say that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was illegitimate, because the Polish government in 1939, September 17, 1939, actually abandoned the country, leaving Poland without a government. And a country without a government isn't a country. So the Soviets waited to come into what was then Eastern Poland, which had been Western Belarus and Western Ukraine. Soviet waited until that point to send the Red Army in there, until the Germans had told them, we have all these documents, until the Germans had told them, there is no more Poland. Now, when the Germans said there is no more Poland, what that meant, in fact, was that the secret codicil to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was no longer valid, because that was an agreement about the state of Poland. But there was no more state of Poland. According to the Germans, there was no more state of Poland. And they said, if you don't come in there, some anti-communist states are going to be formed. And we know the Germans, we know now, the Germans were planning on putting a right-wing Ukrainian nationalists in control and creating a right-wing Ukrainian nationalist state there. Now, of course, Soviets couldn't take that, but no country, no country would have taken that. So, so there's at least among the less fanatic of the anti-communist Soviet scholars, there's increasing recognition that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was, the Soviets were completely correct in signing that treaty with Nazi Germany.
Just like, that is, I had never considered that after the government left, that's what like invalidated the pact or the agreement between Germany and Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the situation. By the way, it was interesting. One of the things you'll read about in one of those places, I can't remember what's in my book or on the website. So in the 1950s, an American scholar named Ginsberg's, with an S, who was an expert in international law, he was a scholar of international law, published 2 articles, 57 and 58, something like that, 58, 59, about this issue, and concludes, if you go back and read those articles, that the Soviet Union had a very good case, that it was not in violation of international law, that they had a very good case for what they did. And that was at the height of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. It was very interesting that this guy wrote the articles and that they were published, although they were published in journals of international law. And you never hear of them. I mean, I remember right. I stumbled across them, but I did. You know, if you look into the evidence, I think it's very clear. Yes, and that's right. The Germans told the Soviets that there is no more state of Poland. That's what that means, is treaties that have to do with the state of Poland are null and void. There's also a principle in international law, which I didn't find out until after I wrote those articles, which is called res ipsi stantibus. Anyway, things remaining the same. In other words, all international treaties are only considered valid as long as the overall situation remains the same. Rebus sic stantibus. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Rebus sic stantibus. Once there are major changes in the international situation, then international treaties are no longer considered valid. And this is certainly an example of that. In fact, this was pointed out to me when I read an article by an Estonian historian, I believe. I had not been familiar with that concept before. So even by international law, what the Soviets did was acceptable. But the European Parliament, which is, as you can imagine, led by all these right-wingers, decided some years ago that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were equally responsible for the beginning of World War II. And of course, the Russian government does not agree with that. They can't take that. Last December 21st, President Putin gave a talk. Of course, it was filmed. He gave a talk to the other leaders of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is this sort of organization of many of the countries that formerly were part of the Soviet Union. It excludes, of course, the Baltics and Ukraine because they didn't agree to be in it, but the other former republics. He gave a talk to the leaders of that group where he brought out 40 or 50 documents from the 1930s to just prove that far from the Soviet Union being partly responsible for the beginning of World War II, is really the Allies plus Poland that were responsible. And these documents are available. I took a couple of days out and hunted them down and put together a collection of them and sent them out to people and so forth. And since then, the Canadian professor I mentioned to you, Michael Carley, has written an article which is available online about how Putin was correct. That's the way he put it. Putin is right. Putin's statement was right. It was attacked by the right-wingers in the United States. Anne Applebaum wrote an article in the Atlantic saying, oh, this is just Stalinist propaganda. And I think the Polish government said it's Stalinist propaganda. And of course it is Stalinist propaganda. That's what the Stalin government said. It just happened to be that the Stalin government was telling the truth. But if you say something Stalinist propaganda, in the minds of certain people, you don't have to disprove it, right? If Stalin said it, therefore it has to be false. So this is the level of discussion that goes on about serious historical matters in the West.